Hello everyone and welcome to today's webcast, GDPR, Tactical Steps You Must Take to Ensure Compliance. This webcast will last approximately 60 minutes and will be recorded for your on-demand viewing after the event is over. All participants will receive the presentation slides and related materials can be found in the attachments and links section on your screen. If you have any questions, please enter them at any time during the webinar and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. We have two GDPR experts presenting today, Clint Eagar and Chris Slovak. Clint has been building, marketing, and optimizing websites for over 15 years. He claims to know a little bit about a lot of things and has relied on to get just about anything done quickly and proficiently. Clint has been with ObservePoint for almost 7 years and has helped support, test, manage, and promote the company from the ground up. He is currently the VP of Data Governance and counts it as a blessing to be part of the ObservePoint team. Before coming to ObservePoint, he managed the enterprise SEO team at Orange Soda, and before that, he was a business consultant on the emerging markets team at Omniture. And our second presenter, Chris Slovak, is VP of Global Sales Solutions at Tealium. Chris serves as a key technical and data governance advisor. He helps customers understand how Tealium's real-time customer data solutions can help solve their unique digital marketing and data security challenges. And now for today's presentation, Chris and Clint, over to you.
All right, well, thanks everybody for joining us. Appreciate you taking the time here today and talk a little bit about GDPR and some of the tactical steps that you can take here. To get us going, I think we wanted to just talk a little bit, We want to talk a little bit about a survey that we did when we had a previous webinar on GDPR, and that actually came out to a pretty crazy statistic that only 1% of the people that we polled during our last review of this had a plan and actually were implementing it. And so we thought that we would spend the day today going through some tactical things that you can do to start building out your plan to get ready for GDPR and get ready to provide the compliance that's going to be necessary for the EU regulation. And to kick us off, I wanted to just kind of do a quick overview of some key aspects of GDPR. I don't want to go into the super details of it because I'm guessing you're here today that you have some familiarity. For those of you that don't, this does apply to you if you have EU citizens using your goods and services, even if those are free. This is an expanded scope and one-stop shop regulation for all data controls for European citizens coming out of the EU. It does affect those companies in the United States or elsewhere where EU citizens are interacting with them. The concepts here are pretty important, but there's a couple that we want to just kind of focus in on. I think the first one is the concept around consent and transparency. So a big part of what the regulation is focused on is giving citizens a better understanding, transparency of what data is being collected and how it's being used. And moreover than that, making sure that all citizens in the EU, they have to give explicit consent for this data collection and usage. And so making sure that you have very specific and very verifiable consent is going to be an absolute must in the new world. This is kind of one of those big headline things that need to be done prior to the May 2018 deadline, and is kind of a foundational piece of the regulation, and actually what we'll talk about here in a minute is becoming more and more standard across the globe. The other big component that I wanted to make sure that we talk about today is the right to be forgotten. There's 380 pages of document there and regulations, but this is a big one. The data subject, or effectively the EU citizen, they have a right to tell you to delete their data set. This data also needs to be done, this deletion has to be done within 24 hours. There are some rules around data transferability and the access to that data. And I think the other one that's kind of critical here is the right to get out of automated decision making. This could be things like predictive modeling, could be things that are A/B split tests, amongst other automated decision-making solutions. And so, when we think about the GDPR, there's quite a few things we have to consider. But a couple of the big ones I want to make sure we talk about because they're very, very tactical in nature is this right to be forgotten, and of course, the need to get consent and transparency. Now, jumping forward, one of the sort of major changes coming out with regulation is the ability for the EU panels to bring in enforcement. And the levels of fines that they are floating, and from the latest reading that I've done, are going to stick around, are very, very serious. Something as simple as not obtaining consent from the data subject can levy a fine to 20 million euros or 4% of take. And they're kind of talking about this being the greater of the two. That's a serious fine. That could be a crippling fine to any business. And then there's more sort of minor infringement things like not having somebody as a DPO registered for the company. Those are about half the size, but they're still very, very significant. And ultimately, you, as the data controller, as the brand, as the owner of the website, the proof of burden is going to lie on you that you've done your due diligence, that you've collected consent, you've made sure that you followed processes and procedures in alignment with these regulations. And that sort of proof of burden is going to be quite a big thing that you're going to have to work on. And we're going to talk about today specifically around how you can do audits and start to build out your plan forward on that front. Now, not to be left in the dark, well, we are talking about data governance, and today we're focusing on GDPR. I think we really need to talk about what's happening in the rest of the space as well. Here in the U.S., there was a panel held on probabilistic matching. This is relatively old, but the director of the FTC came out and started to infer that personally identifiable information, which could be referred to as PII, is persistent identifiers like cookies and MAC addresses and IP addresses. Now, it's not law here, and we don't have a regulation as sort of robust as GDPR, but clearly regulators in the United States are starting to consider and look at what's happening across the pond. And I think, over the course of the next 5 years, more than likely we'll see similar regulation here in the United States. And this isn't even, just the EU and the U.S., Western nations. It's also happening in Asia. I just spent a week in Indonesia actually talking quite about this subject. And, China just released a brand new cybersecurity law that is very specific on how and what type of data is able to move out of China. The APP or the Australian privacy principles, they define very specifically what sensitive information is. Singapore has the PDPA, and Japan's new APPI has a brand new central enforcement agency similar to what they're doing in GDPR, so they actually can pull down and put enforcement and fines against companies that are not following this. So as we kind of dive into this today, and we're talking about GDPR, we think it's really critical that we consider data governance in sort of a larger picture, because it is something that we as an industry have to focus on and have to deal with. It's not something that's going to be limited to the EU laws. Now, today we're going to work and focus on how you can start to audit and document your properties, your vendors, consider and figure out how to deal with the transfer of data, help you start to build processes in place to establish security measures and build panels to discuss these measures. Try to give you guys some time frames, and we have some leave behinds at the end of the presentation that you can use as a project roadmap. And then hopefully we'll just pepper in a lot of information as you go in here. I know Clint's got some great materials to kind of just get you excited. One final parting step that I want to talk about before we move on is that when we talk about data governance, I think it's important we talk about the customer at the center. We as an industry, we get a little freaked out about the legal ramifications and the risk therein in terms of fines. But at the end of the day, data and all this data that's under the microscope, it's the language of our customer relationships. It's how we build brand experiences. And when we consider the fact that we have this data about our customers or prospective customers, and we think about it in the right way and the fact that we're using it because we want to build experience for those customers, then data governance and GDPR compliance really should be considered as part of just building brand trust, right? And creating relationships and experiences that are right for the customer. And so I think when we think about data governance, it is something that we have to absolutely deal with, and it has some very tactical things that we need to work on in the next 6 to 18 months. But let's do it in the light that it's a positive thing for consumers, it's a positive thing for the industry, and it's going to be it's going to be a way that you build brand trust and brand equity with your prospective customers. So with that, let's go ahead and start diving in and talk about sort of the next 5 things to get you started.
All right, thanks, Chris. So what we're going to talk about next is those 5 steps that Chris mentioned, and these are downloadable in a one-pager in the attachments and links. It's called the 5 Steps to Data Governance. So if you're looking for those 5 steps in one concise place, that's where you'll find them. All right, the first thing that we're recommending, and we're recommending to really get started on this right away, is to really know the landscape of all of your digital properties. You've got your mobile apps, you've got your OTT devices, of course you've got your various web properties and your websites. And what points of data are they collecting? What different technology vendors have been deployed on those properties? Right now, just in the marketing technology space, we know of just over 5,000 different technologies that are being used in the marketplace. And so the question really there to ask is, which are we using? Why is it there? I'm going to go into more specifics on this here in just a minute, but really start thinking about what kinds of data are these different vendors collecting on our various digital properties. So what we need to do here is perform discovery on that. So if it's a mobile application, if it's an OTT device, those are typically more simple. Websites can be very complex. One of our key customers here at ObservePoint, just on their homepage, of that list of 5,000 different technologies, they have 50 different marketing technologies deployed on their website, and so that's just on their homepage, right? And so we need to have some discovery mechanisms put in place that we can use to be able to find all those different technologies that are out there, and then start creating a database of those technologies. There's an attachment for that as well that you can use. It's just a sample spreadsheet that you could use. Some other kind of database may suit your organization better, but really get started on this really quickly. And then just over the next 1 to 3 months, we're recommending that you document each one of those technologies, and you're asking the questions of those technologies, such as, who's the business owner of that technology? What does it do for us? And why is it on the site, right? And then also, really important question, where's the data being stored? Is it our data? Are we collecting it internally? Or is it going overseas? Might that data contain some PII that's being stored on servers here in the States, but it's for a business in Belgium, for example? And then one really important question to ask is, who has access to this information as well, within the company and also any third parties who may have access to that data as well. And then this should also be part of your ongoing data protection impact assessment, or the DPIA, which is part of the GDPR regulations, so that you're always on this, that this database is always kept up to date, so that you have proper contacts in place, you have proper business owners within the organization. And then spending just a little bit more time talking about security and privacy, because this is really what's at the core of the GDPR regulations, is that our customers' data is safe and secure with us. And so once again, want you thinking about who has access to all the data. And then within that, who can actually act on that? If this is like a transaction data, say for an e-commerce transaction, right? Somebody in the fulfillment team is going to need to act on that data, right? But can they get access to any other information that they shouldn't? And then also be looking at, how is that data transferred from one place to another? So here, this next slide will talk a little bit about not all, but but some of the different ways that data could be transferred around the internet. Your apps and videos and, an SDK within an app. Maybe there's an API connection or a database to database connection, and there's data being transferred. Are those data flow mechanisms, are they secure? And then is the data that's going to all of those, is that known as well? This is going to be really important when a customer raises their hand and says, hey, I want to be erased. Right? We need to know how all of these data points are talking to each other so that right to erasure can be facilitated very quickly. And like Chris mentioned, within a 24-hour period. So just one really simple, quick example here of one of our customers in Belgium. And this is just a tiny little sample on their homepage, right? And so you can see here just some of the network requests that are happening behind the scenes as that page loads. And so if any one of these were sending data, we're sending any kind of customer or PII type data outside of Europe, then the GDPR is going to have a problem with that. Now we can see that some of these tags are actually like an Adobe Analytics tag, right? And so Adobe already has a rule that says you're not supposed to put any PII inside Adobe Analytics, right? And so one thing that I see quite a bit inside people's Adobe data is an IP address. And so now we know that we got to be pretty careful about collecting IP addresses, right? Specifically if it's a static IP address. And so we need to be careful with those things as well. So just be here. This initiative is just really to be aware of what's on the site, do extensive discovery to know what's on all your different digital properties, and then start building out that database of those technologies.
Great. And this is a great start and a great point to talk about teams. And, we're going to start to talk about this theme throughout the rest of the presentation, which is this is not something that you can do on your own. Whether you're the business team and you own the relationships with the vendors in terms of how you use them, and or if you're the technology team and your job is to integrate those vendors and or in many cases store the data and have the big data warehouses, right? Both teams need to be involved. And in this particular step, I think the first thing you have to do, right, as a business team is to help identify the vendors that you're using. Here at Tealium, I think we have over 50 different vendors that we use, and we actually built out a database. We started with a spreadsheet, now we have it running on QuickBase, which is an Intuit product, where we literally have each team put in the vendors they use, why they use them, what they do with them, and what level of access the vendor has to the data. And that document has to be updated every 6 months. On the flip side of that, the technology team, they evaluate that. They help to audit the vendor technology against the contracts or the policies that we've agreed to with those vendors. And in those circumstances where necessary, they communicate to the business before they do it, but they either sort of push and or get us to remove vendors that are unused or not in compliance. And so, when you think about everything we're going to do here today, this has got to be a team effort. And you're going to see as we start to talk about how we build out the next phase of this, which is to define and develop that data inventory. Both the teams come in once again. So once you start to do your due diligence, figure out what it is that you're doing, and you start to figure out your data flow and trying to do sort of a check on what you have out there, the next piece of the puzzle is to actually build a data inventory. And when you're building a data inventory, the first thing that we need to do is agree on the level of sensitivity from and around the data types you're collecting. A great example that Clint brought up was IP address. From a GDPR perspective, that's personally identifiable information. It has high sensitivity, and as such, it needs to be treated. You need to know exactly where and how that level of sensitive data is being collected, right? And you need to document that in this data inventory. Now, the technology team, one of the main ways that they can actually help in this particular phase is they can actually provide a solution that tracks all of this information for the organization. Like I said, here at Tealium, we actually have our network operations team. They manage our QuickBase instance, and they set it up, right? And they have the rest of us to sort of fill it out. And so I think, integrate with or not integrate, but interact with your technology teams and see if they already have solutions that can help with this. In many cases as well, once you do identify in certain circumstances, that there are sensitive data points, having the technology team go through and provide an audit of what is actually integrated, what is actually going to these vendors is a big piece of the puzzle. And the technology teams can be tremendously helpful in that front. Now, when we talk about data inventory, Clint already talked a little bit about how data is processed and where it's stored, right? These are the questions that you want to ask your vendor and consider when you're looking at the sources of data. But you really need to start thinking about whether or not you own the data. Now, we as marketers in the business side of that world, we throw the words, first, second, and third-party data around a lot because we use it for a variety of different marketing, campaign, and targeting purposes. Now, ultimately, though, right, the ownership of that data is probably one of the most critical pieces in this conversation, right? And when we talk about ownership, we talk about access, and we talk about access, we certainly come into the concept of consent, transparency of that access, and then the need to be forgotten. Because in many cases, if you put sensitive data into third-party data sets where the data is now shared, owned by somebody else, and then distributed without your consent, you lose it, right? And you lose access therein. So when you're talking to your vendors and you're talking about the data, you have to flag and consider, right, what the ultimate ownership is of the data point, right? Things like IP addresses and email addresses, you need to make sure those stay first party, right? These are highly sensitive points of data. They're defined in things like the GDPR as such, and you are going to be responsible as a data controller, right, for where they go, how they're used, who sees them, and ultimately the need to delete them if asked. And so when we think about, once again, building our data inventory, it's one thing to just take an inventory of what's going where, but defining the level of sensitivity of the data and in its ultimate ownership in terms of at rest per vendor is actually one of the most critical pieces of the inventory process.
All right, continuing on discussing about the various teams that we need to form within our companies. As Chris mentioned, we have the business team and the technology team. So we're going to talk a little bit more here in points 3, well, for here on out about how these different teams are going to work together a little bit and some more of the roles that they need to have. So really, one of the main goals of the business team is to really develop the policies and the procedures that we're going to follow for each of the vendors and for each of the points of data that we collect or each of the databases that we have, and really create those governance policies. And then one really important thing that the business team will be responsible for is all of our internal communication within our companies of how we're treating customer data, how we're putting the customer at the center, and how we're handling right to erasure requests. And then the technology teams, some of their main goals are to make sure that each technology and then each of those vendors has very minimal access to the data. They only have the data that they need, essentially. And then making sure that we're, as Chris mentioned, that the technology team is actually performing these audits and making sure that our internal processes for data processing and data transfer are consistent and correct according to our policies and procedures. All right, and then one of the recommendations from the GDPR that's recommended based kind of on company size is having an executive that is the primary responsible party for our GDPR compliance. Now, I look at this this position primarily as that first and last voice of the customer, to really put themselves in the customer's shoes and say, here's this data process that we have, or here's this data that we're collecting as a company. Do we actually need it to provide the service that we're providing for the customer, and then really always ask those questions. Why do we need this data? And if it were me, do I want this data collected about me? And so they're going to be the gatekeeper of all the different technologies that we have on the site. They're going to essentially oversee the business and technology teams, or at least facilitate that as well, making sure that those privacy and data policies are in place, and give their final stamp of approval on those. And then making sure that internally within the company, as they meet with stakeholders, as they work, that really the customer privacy and the data security is really that first priority whenever we're talking about our customers' needs. And then if necessary, if there's any right to erasure requests that come through, to make sure that those are properly escalated. And then if there's any problems or challenges with that, they're the one that gets to talk to the press, essentially, right? And so we want to make sure that this position is empowered to be able to really interface with all the other stakeholders within the company, and has the authority to affect change within the organization as well.
So a great framework for having these discussions is what's in it for the business, right? The way that you want to think about putting vendors in a position to collect data and or consider the data being collected or the data that they need is to first start with a consideration around what the service is that they're providing. How critical is that service to the business strategy? What levels of features within the product are you actually using? In many cases that we see, companies are buying MarTech vendors that have a whole variety of features, but you're typically purchasing them for one or two sort of main project or main use cases. So focus on giving them data that they need for that perspective. Okay. And then when you think about and you've defined what it is the service is, how important the service is, and what features of the service you're going to use, clearly it leads to, well, what data is needed for that to happen, right? If I'm providing experiences on the homepage or product recommendations, I'm doing no probabilistic matching, and I'm not doing any type of algorithmic stuff, do they actually need IP address? And in many cases, the answer would probably be no. Does the third-party data collection vendor need the email address? Probably not, right? These are sort of those situations where you need to think about, what data is actually critical for that service to execute, and not just take an integration guide, and just install. You really need to start to think about what it is that these vendors, and I'll extend that from vendor to publishers as well, in terms of what kind of critical data they need to provide the services that they want. And then ultimately, you should do all of this in the guise of, what's in it for the customer. Remember that customer at the center mandate. If you can't clearly tell a prospective customer or customer, right, why you're collecting and using the data and sending it to this vendor, if you can't clearly tell them that in a statement that provides them with value, then you're doing something wrong, right? Just consider yourselves as customers. Do you really want your data going every which way if it's not actually needed? I think the answer to that would probably be no. And so if you use this framework, right, what's the service, and define what we're using within that service as a feature function perspective, to think about the data required for that service to actually operate, and then always have a value discussion in terms of how it provides value to the customer. If you do these things as you're making decisions on what vendors you're going to use, how you're going to deploy those vendors, and what data you're going to provide those vendors, you're going to be in a great place. Now, this leads into a great conversation around building internal governance panels. Now, developing communication plans are one thing, but executing them are another. And so sitting down together and building a framework of communication and defining roles and responsibilities within the organization on this panel is hugely important in terms of getting ready for compliance and just data governance as a whole, right? Clearly, the business team needs to continue to drive marketing, customer experiences, support and focus on the business side of the legal ramifications. And then they have expectations that they should define very clearly for the technology teams. And vice versa, the technology teams have to continue to focus best practices on data access, right? They provide technical support and actually make sure that we protect the data wherever possible, and especially when stored and hosted by the company itself. But they have to enable the business, and I think that this is something that's missed far too often, where I see, the friction happen between business and technology teams, right? Where the business wants to do everything under the sun, and the technology team wants to do nothing. And we have to figure out how to come together, and we have to come together using these frameworks and coming together with the previous data inventory and data audits that we've done, right? So that we can have an educated discussion and a business meets technology discussion around whether or not we move forward with a particular vendor or what type of data we collect. Now, one way to do this is to develop what's called a collection directive. Now, this is one that I've put together. If you do a Google search, you'll find a ton of these out there, and I really recommend you build one that makes sense for your business. But essentially, you want to build it on a 3 or 4 axis basis, and you want to consider who's in the data panel, right, in that governance panel that we were talking about prior, right? And of course, you're going to have your IT and your tech team. You're going to have legal representation. You're going to have marketing teams. Depending on your business, you might have, sales organizations as well involved in this discussion. And you want to think about this in terms of, in my case, we do a 3-tier process. We think about data accessibility against the need for data control and the importance and the business impact of the data or the vendor itself, okay? And so the way that we can do this is we can consider things like a vendor and the service that the vendor provides, whether it's something as critical as CRM that collects lots and lots of data, or we can actually use the same model for an individual data point like an IP address. And effectively what you want to do is you want to build a sliding scale where the sensitivity of the data, the trustworthiness of the vendor, and the business impact drives how and where and when the data is provided to the particular vendor or exposed to vendors as a whole, right? So let me give you a really good example of this, right? So if we're talking about something, and I know Clint's alma mater is Omniture, so we'll talk a little bit about web analytics and Adobe, right? This is a very important piece of the technology stack for the business, right? They need visibility in what's happening, and I would even argue that they need that in real time, and that the level of access has got to be very, very robust, except for a couple key values. And generally speaking, a vendor like Adobe, I would say, is a trustworthy vendor. And so, it's okay to install that data client side, let it have a significant amount of access and do that in real time. Versus, right, maybe, my apologies to anyone out there who's on the affiliate side of the house, right, but affiliate networks have kind of traditionally have a bad rap for data storage and a bad rap for how they piggyback things in, right? Well, maybe on that circumstance, you flag those vendors and those tool sets as untrusted. Yes, they're important, but maybe they're up to 2% of the business, so I would classify them as maybe non-critical. And, maybe we want to scrub the access that they have or limit their access. And, in the tag management world, that might be putting them in an iframe. In the server-side world, it might be giving them batch data sets, right? And so you have to define what this directive is. And again, this is just a good framework that you can start with. You have to consider what your business teams are that are going to participate in that governance panel. But once you define sort of these checkpoints, we build that sliding scale of control meets business impact meets legal ramification. You'll find that having a conversation in terms of deployment, accessibility, and onboarding of a particular vendor or source of data becomes much, much easier because you have this framework, the framework's decided upon, and you don't have to look at every single one in a vacuum, in a silo, and have sort of the knee-jerk reaction that you have because you've got this framework in place.
All right, so just to finish up here on step number 5 of the checklist, once again talking about the business and the technology teams as part of that panel, or as teams that provide information to that technology panel. Some things you can get started on right away is making sure that your privacy policies and like data usage policies, cookie usage, IP, all the like intellectual property, PII, all that information, all that is up to date in your various policies that are either on your websites or in your mobile applications or wherever they might be. And now, I would recommend that this be very clear and very simple. A lot of times when we read a licensing agreement, that licensing agreement is like 10 pages long, and there's information about our privacy buried in the middle of it somewhere. I'm thinking that one of the tenets of the GDPR is to make that clear and easily accessible for our customers. And like Chris mentioned at the very beginning, this could be one of the things that we can do to really start building that brand to trust, right, is that we're very open about this is the points of data that we're collecting, and here's why. And so these are some things you can get started on right away. I would think within the next, as you form these teams within your company, one of your primary initiatives would be to start getting these policies up to date. And then making sure that in all your various marketing channels that all of your opt-outs are in place and functioning correctly. Actually test those to make sure that they're working as expected. And then making sure that team and that relationship that you have with your technology team is sound and trustworthy. That you're there for each other, essentially, kind of like Chris was talking about. Making sure that that your asks of the technology team aren't too exuberant, and vice versa on the technology team. That you're always thinking about how can we help the business here. And then some of the responsibilities here that I think you can start working on right away as well for the technology team is making sure that your explicit opt-ins and opt-outs are in place, wherever those might be, making sure that those are there, and then start to think about how are you going to handle these right to be forgotten requests. Is it a form on your site? Is it is it in the mobile app? Is it is it a button you can click? Or how is that gonna play out so that when somebody pushes that button, that all the dominoes start to fall over and the data is erased. And then of course, last but not least, is making sure, once again, that communication is just really open between the business team and the other members within the organization as needed. So those are the 5 takeaways. The 5 main takeaways that we want you to have for today. So the first of those, once again, is due diligence. And this is really knowing what's out there, knowing on all of your digital properties, once again, whether that be an OTT, a mobile device, your various websites, or really any other thing where one of your customers is interacting with your brand, making sure you know what's out there. And so that's just, as I read the regulations for GDPR, one of the things that I see that they're going to be looking for is that you're doing your due diligence. And part of that due diligence is building that data inventory that we talked about, and then putting controls in place so that as data is transferred from one place to another, as the data is being collected, that you understand what that data is being used for, and so do your customers. And then working on forming a data governance panel that may have members of the sales team, the legal team, marketing teams, the technology teams, so on and so forth, so that we have that in place so that we know what we're doing, because each company is going to be a little different, right? The points of data that we're collecting, how our structures within our companies are set up, and so that's something that you want to be looking at very carefully as well. And then one of the most important things as I look at the GDPR regs is that we're providing clear and really, really open communication to our customers, and also internally as well, so that, that we start to build the culture internally within our companies that we want to treat our customers' data with the utmost respect and integrity, and so that and that we also put mechanisms in place that enforce that as well, and so that we don't have to rely just on good behavior, if you will.
So I actually asked to put my two little girls here just to really drive home the concept that this is a good thing. We as an industry probably need a little bit of guidance on how to protect customers' data. And I think about my two little girls, right? And the fact that they and I don't want their data going everywhere, and I actually kind of personally am excited to see that consumer data and consumer privacy is becoming more of a mainstream discussion and a serious discussion because it is going to be important to the future of the internet, and it's important to us as both marketers and technologists, but also as consumers, right, out there every day. And I think you can use this as a competitive differentiator. People and companies, I think, are undervaluing trust and brand trust. There was recently a study done by the AMA that said that 89% of people surveyed will spend more money with those brands that they trust. And we've actually seen that. The last OmniShopper MasterCard report that came out, people are spending more money with less merchants and less vendors. And I assure you, well, while it's probably a little bit of Amazon, it has a lot to do with trust, and it has a lot to do with accessibility of information. And so, I encourage you to share, your roadmap with customers. Tell them what you do to protect them and build the relationship and the trust with them. You have to make sure that you don't just, give this lip service. You actually have to ensure that you follow those procedures and you follow those messages, right? Focus on this as a customer at the center mandate, right? Focus on this as being a focus around how we build value for them. Not necessarily, a thing that we have to do because we're going to get sued. I think that that's not the right way to go about this. I think we need to focus on it as an issue, as a positive thing, and use it as a competitive differentiator in your conversations and in the way that you communicate with your partners. So I think with that, we're going to take a couple questions. We've got a few really good ones, and I think I'm going to kick it off. There was a good question here around regulations in Canada, and there is actually regulations in Canada. I believe it's called the PIPEDA or PIPEDA. I'm not a Canadian law expert. I just know that we just recently had to do that with a big telecom company there that we're doing business with. So I don't believe that they have major regulation changes in terms of focusing on enforcement, but they definitely flag what sensitive data is, and they do have some regulations around whether or not specific types of data can leave Canada, especially in heavily regulated markets. I would, if you're working in Canada or collecting data from Canadian citizens, I would definitely consult your legal team. But I do know that they have similar regulations. It's something we didn't cover here today, but maybe we can do in a future one.
Okay, there's another question here that asks, what's the best way to go about determining my data flow? This is going to be kind of tricky in some places, right? Because the first thing you need to know is what data is being collected and where, and so which technologies are collecting that data, right? And then essentially map that out of where it's going. So this can be kind of tricky, right? And I think that's going to be one of the harder parts here about that data flow, because a lot of times there's something that happens client side, and that hits a beacon on Adobe server, and then maybe it gets passed to ComScore, and so there's some piggybacking going on, right? And so how is that data flow going? So I think it is going to be kind of complex. And so some things about the hierarchy of information can be useful. We have a couple of tools about that as well that can help start answering some of those questions. But I think it is going to be kind of a tricky thing really to sort out here.
All right, so I'm going to answer two of these. There's a ton of them here, so hopefully we'll get through as many as we can here today. When does GDPR officially be in place? The current timeline, as they've announced, is in May of 2018. I think the scary part is, scary for all of us, is they're still making changes to the regulation. Some of the things like the e-privacy directive still hasn't really been locked down. So, it still is a little bit in flux. Some of the major themes that we've talked about here today, those are likely not going to change. And so, being prepared with consent and transparency, that's kind of number one on the list. And if you know where your data is going and how it's going, you'll be in good shape. Let's see here. Are there any regulations in LATAM? Clint, I don't know if you know the answer to that. I do not know. I can tell you that it feels like the whole world is talking about it. But do you know if there's anything in Latin America?
I don't, but like you said before, I'm glad that we're starting to talk about this a lot more. Because for myself and for my family, I want to make sure that our data is safe and secure. So, if there's not yet, there will be in the not too distant future, I would think.
There's a good question in here around consent for mobile applications like a smartphone, and that one is something you're going to have to work directly with your mobile application developers on, right? I think the nice thing about mobile applications, especially more often than not, the very first thing you have to do is sign up or sign in, at which point in time you would agree to the terms of service, and the terms of service would be containing, that consent to track. You have a little bit more control in the mobile app world just because you will be able to build that into your devices. Clearly in those circumstances, if you have an application that doesn't have some sort of login where you have to agree to terms of services before you use it, you can have your developers build in, for example, controls within the app that don't fire up SDKs that are collecting data.
One other thing that we may want to keep in mind with mobile apps as well is as we start to build in those controls on the new versions of our applications, we need to be aware that some of our users may still be using an older version of the app that doesn't have some of those policies put in place yet. And so just keep that in mind as well. That I'm not sure what the solution is going to be there, but I think it's something we need to consider.
I like this question, and I think this one's right up your alley, Clint, so I might have you talk about it. But how will this impact our ability to monitor basic web metrics? You want to take that one, Clint?
Yeah, as I read that question, I think it's a really great question. But I don't see it really impacting the baseline web metrics, things like page views and visitors, and like the counts of these things, and this event or that event, because there's not really any customer-specific data in there at all, and there's not really anything about an individual in that. There shouldn't be, I should say, and that's really actually part of Adobe's policies as well. That there shouldn't be any PII in the Adobe Analytics data at all, and Google has those same policies. If you're a Google Analytics user. And actually, like Web Trends does, and Core Metrics, and like everybody has pretty much those same policies, right? And so your baseline metrics, I don't see that really being impacted at all by these regulations, with the exception if you happen to be collecting some IP addresses or some email addresses on accident, you should get those cleaned up right away and stop doing that.
What else we got? Do we have some time for a few more here, I think, before we finish up? So how can we help collecting consent and making proof for the cookies? I think this is a question around the support of Tealium and ObservePoint on that front. So I would suggest, and we're going to talk about this in a second, we have a section on tealium.com/GDPR that will talk a little bit about the solutions that we can provide, but there's a variety of tools out there that can help you build up the little pop-up windows and the banners to ensure collection. I think the key there is to make sure that you don't send any data off to vendors, and that you integrate whatever the decision is from the consumer within your tagging, or in the case of the mobile apps, you're doing it within your mobile application collection.
So just there's just one question that came in just as a follow-up about PII within Adobe Analytics, where the IP address is collected kind of by default. Yeah. So you're 100% right that it is, and so we've got to look at that, right? And so is this something, is practice we're probably going to need to stop and figure out how to do that, because it is kind of out of the box that it is collected. Now, as I understand it, the mandate is more specifically about a static IP address, but I also take that one step back and say, is it maybe a long-term lease on my IP address as well? Maybe I've got that, the IP address lease for, for a couple of months or for 60 days or whatever. That still can be construed as PII in my opinion, and so we want to make it as make sure that we're clear on that as well. So yeah, some things are probably going to have to change there, I would think.
Let's do a couple of good questions around working with a vendor and determining whether or not they're compliant, and then figuring out your data flows and their data flows. We kind of gave you a general sort of way to think about it in terms of the sort of data flow that is, where's the data, what is the data, where is the data, where does it go, once it gets there, who and where is it stored, and then who has access to it. And so part of your technology team's vetting, in many cases, I know because we do it all the time here, they're going to ask those questions to your vendor. If they're not, I would communicate with your technology team and start to build up a list of questions that you should ask as an information security, review for any vendor that comes into place. From a compliancy perspective, that's a contracting and legal thing in terms of like literally asking them, or not necessarily asking them, but making sure that you have the right model clauses in place so that you're covered on that front. I am not aware of a registry at this time for a list of them. I don't know if the group knows of a registry. There are several levels of certification that you can get as an individual, so that you can actually perform the DPO role, and then the individual companies can seek certification as well as they can work to get their privacy shield in place, which talks a little bit about how data can move from the EU to the US under specific circumstances. Why don't we take one more question, Clint, and then we'll follow up with the materials that we have.
Yeah, maybe you could actually speak to this one, Chris. There's a question here about it. If a customer, the customer has the right to see whatever data we have about them, what are you thinking is going to be the right mechanism for that?
Yeah, that's one that's going to be really tricky, mainly because we have a challenge in the space where a lot of the data that we collect about a particular individual is spread out all over the vendor set, not to mention your own back-end systems. I can tell you how Tealium's approaching it, right? We're approaching the sort of challenge of the space, which is, that there's a kind of a missing piece of the marketing technology stack, which is this data supply chain layer. Tealium, we're building a universal data hub that you can actually onboard, manage the data before it leaves your sort of first-party hands, if it were, to any of the vendors in the stack. And sort of by the nature of doing this, you'd be able to expose to a particular customer all the data that you have on them. Yeah, I don't really know that I have a good answer for that outside using a tool like a CDP to start to expose that. Even then, that doesn't necessarily expose all the data, right? Because you have more data likely than that, or that is attached to the user. So for us, this is how we're approaching this problem, and we have views into that sort of data that we collect and we provide to our customers. But that's going to be a big challenge, a technical challenge for sure. So I know we still have a ton of questions here. I want to make sure that we have a little bit of time to finish up, talk about the materials that we have for all of you, starting with our websites, our team's websites, and definitely encourage you guys to go in and take a look at both ObservePoint's website audit solutions, and then on Tealium.com/GDPR. We talked a little bit earlier on some of these documents, our checklists, some videos on what GDPR is and how it's going to affect your business. We've developed some timeline solutions and some documents that can help you build out your project as well.
Yeah, then from our side, we do encourage you, to request that free website audit. Really as to get started building out that discovery process that we talked about. And then we've also created a GDPR cheat sheet for you. It's also linked in the attachments. I'm here in Bright Talk as well. That you can get, or we'll have it on our site here shortly also. And I think that's about it, right, Chris? Yeah.
I think that's what we all have for today.
Yeah, just on the ObservePoint side, just want to say thanks for everyone that attended. We really appreciate your time, and look forward to talking to you in the future.
Yeah, same here from Tealium. Thank you so much for everyone's attendance and great questions. I know we didn't get to all of them today. We'll try to get you guys some sort of official response to some of these questions and comments. Somebody made a really good point, and I did kind of misspeak on that. E-privacy directive is its own regulation, but there's a lot of things still moving around in the world of governance outside of GDPR that we have to keep an eye on. So we'll continue to have these conversations and these dialogues and provide as many bits of material as we can. Thanks, everybody.